Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, Volume 1, Crusades prior to the rise of the Ayyubid state. Start of Part 8 of Chapter 3. John LaMonte's opinion of Imad ad-Deen Zangi. John LaMonte was regarded as one of the most prominent American historians during the first half of the last century. He wrote several books about the Crusades, most notably his comprehensive study of feudalism in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But he wrote another study entitled Crusade and Jihad. In this study, LaMonte focused on refuting the idea of jihad among Muslims at that time, and depicted the actions of the leaders of the Islamic Jihad at that time as being motivated solely by political and economic factors. He asserts that Imad ad-Deen Zangi cannot be regarded in any way as a hero of jihad, and that he had wanted to take back Edessa for a long time, as Kamal ad-Din ibn al-Azim says, but he did not start to think seriously about it until at a later stage, after he was urged to do so by the Emir of Iran, Jamaluddin Abul Ma'ali Fadlallah ibn Mahan, who explained to him how easy it would be to occupy the city. LaMonte explains, it seems that he himself regarded occupying Edessa as contrary to his policies, and something that he did on the basis of incitement of others. He also states, Zangi's capture of Hama and Aleppo, and his wars against the Artugids, were more important to him than fighting the Christians, and he did not object to forming an alliance with the Latins if he thought it was in his interest. It is possible to refute these views by noting the following points. The fact that Imad ad-Din Zangi delayed attacking Edessa does not diminish his role in jihad at all, especially since he thought that he should use up the energy of this Crusader principality through his conflicts and attacks against its fortifications, after which he would go and attack the principality itself once he had acquired an understanding of its defenses and found out its weak points as well as its strong points. On the other hand, it is natural to suppose that the advice of the Emir of Harran to Zangi to capture Edessa could not have changed the situation at all if Zangi had not planned previously for that. It is difficult to imagine the fall of that principality happening as depicted by LaMonte. Rather, it is more likely that it had been part of Zangi's plan for a long time. As for the reason why Zangi did not capture it earlier, this was because during the early stages of his rule, he did not want to exhaust his military forces in premature confrontations with the Crusaders when there was no guarantee of the outcome. Hence, it is possible to regard the timing of Edessa's capture, based on what is explained in the Latin, Syriac, and Arabic sources, as one of the greatest proofs of Zangi's political brilliance. It seems that LaMonte's claim that the fall of Edessa was not part of the policy of Imad ad-Din Zangi is a claim that has no historical support. It is well known that Zangi was a member of Maudud's army, or as Ibn al-Athir put it, he was present with him during his wars. No doubt Zangi understood the importance of capturing Edessa, and indeed this dream had been entrenched in his mind for a long time, and one would imagine that he wanted to succeed where Maudud had failed before him. He thought that capturing Edessa was essential on the basis that it was the closest Crusader target to Mosul. Achieving this goal would also make communication with northern Syria easier, especially given his strong belief in the importance of uniting the Muslims. John LaMonte's suggestion that Zangi could have formed an alliance with the Latin rulers to serve his political interests is a suggestion which confirms the political acumen of Imad ad-Din Zangi. He resorted to making deals with the Crusaders occasionally in order to catch his breath and avoid being caught between two fronts. The Eastern Front, where he had conflicts with other political forces, and the front which represented his conflict with the Crusaders. Moreover, he wanted to put the minds of others at rest by means of such deals, whilst concealing his intention to put an end to Edessa. Hence his operations to lay siege to it came as a surprise to its inhabitants. With regard to the idea that the fall of Edessa was not Zangi's only goal, but that he was also trying to build his state at the expense of his neighbors, both Muslim and Christian, it should be noted that all the Muslim leaders who emerged during the 2 centuries of the Crusade period of the 12th and 13th centuries Common Era, that is 6th and 7th centuries Hijri, and contributed to the cause of jihad had some sort of political ambition. They certainly strove to establish their own states at the expense of neighboring political forces, but the point here is that political ambition, as I pointed above, may be used to serve the interests of the Ummah as a whole, and that is jihad, because these leaders could have accepted a life of humiliation and giving it to the Crusaders, and not tried to expand their own territory at their expense in order to avoid stirring up political trouble with them and to avoid bloodshed, not to mention exposing the regions of their original influence to Crusader attacks. They rejected that though, and accepted the Crusader challenge, and demonstrated their ability to change the political map of the region by taking on jihad missions. It is important to note that it is no secret to researchers of Muslim relations with the Christian forces during the Crusades that a number of Orientalists sought to deny Muslim achievements and cast doubts on the bright stages of their history. A sense of vengeance is always discernible among this group, especially when it comes to jihad, which is the pinnacle of Islam. Hence they strove very hard to deny this idea, and cast aspersions upon it, and to speak ill of all past experiences of jihad, so that Muslims would not adopt this idea in the present and in the future. Thus it is possible to state, objectively and without jumping to conclusions, that the era of the Crusades witnessed a quantum leap in the development of the idea of jihad in Islam, because this time the jihad was against an enemy that had settled in the Muslim lands as a result of Muslim weakness that was caused by internal conflicts. If we realize that their religious identity was at risk due to the Christianization project, on which the papacy was pinning its greatest hopes, we will understand the great importance of the idea of jihad during the Crusade era. Consequently, Western sources, both classical and modern, have tried to distort the images of this great mujahid. One of the most well-known contemporary books is Holy War, The Crusades and Their Impact on Today's World. The author of this book, Karen Armstrong, says of Imad ad-Din Zangi, "This man was no paragon. He was often dead drunk and was as cruel and ruthless as most men of war at this time. The biography of this man proves false what they say. Our Muslim historians describe him as a martyr, which is the highest title that is bestowed only on those who deserve it. They have stated that he was one of the best kings in attitude, with the greatest resolve in dealing with matters. His subjects were safe and secure, and the strong were unable to transgress against the weak. He venerated Islamic law, established it in his state, and appointed judges to implement it. The aims of some Orientalists include the following: A. Distorting the meaning of jihad so that our generation will remain without examples to strengthen their resolve and motivate them. B. Weakening the spirit of sacrifice, martyrdom, and jihad in the Ummah so that they can drive the Muslims like cattle. C. Attempting to separate the Ummah from its history by means of fabrications and distortions, so that Muslims will not refer to their history and learn lessons from it. D. Their writings stem from a hateful crusader spirit, which resents the heroes who contributed to the failure of the Crusader venture. It is for this reason that the Orientalists have tried to distort the image of Imad ad-Deen Zangi. The biography of Imad ad-Deen Zangi and his dedicated supporters, such as Al-Qadi ash-Shahrazuri, definitely expose, beyond any doubt, the lies of those Orientalists who have tried to erase the facts and make false accusations against the great man. His experience of jihad deserves to be studied and analyzed in depth, and the conclusions drawn should be applied to our contemporary situation, so that we may benefit from them in a sincere effort to revive the Ummah. Poets praise for Imad ad-Deen after the conquest. Many researchers and writers have not paid attention to literature when it comes to the Crusades. Indeed, many regard it as a literature of decline, following the statements and views of the Orientalists, who want us to avoid studying the literature of those wars for many reasons, such as their desire that we should not learn of the viciousness and cruelty of the Crusaders, and so that we should not feel pride when reading of the history of Muslim heroes, Arabs, Kurds, and Turks, who led armies under the banner of Islam, fighting, striving, prevailing and rising above ignorant tribalism and nationalism, united by their love for Allah and His Messenger, and jihad for the sake of Allah, seeking His pleasure. The literature of that period still needs comprehensive study, research, and evaluation. Then we will see a positive change in our views, because we will find much that needs to be researched, and we will find a wealth of refined poetry, which speaks of zeal and describes the battles, praising the heroes. We will also find a great deal of sorrowful poetry, which eulogizes the slain. There is a substantial amount of poetry, which speaks of the conquest of Edessa and praises Imad ad-Din al-Zangi. Military events after the conquest. The conquest of Edessa was an introduction to the events that came after it, as it was not difficult for Imad ad-Din Zangi to complete his mission by conquering the remaining Crusader fortresses belonging to this principality, taking advantage of the collapse of Crusader strength in this region. He headed towards Suruj, which had been abandoned by its garrison, and captured it. Soon the neighboring fortresses began to fall into his hands, one after another. He did not pass by any of its towns or fortresses, but it surrendered to him immediately. He then proceeded to the citadel of Bira, overlooking the Euphrates, which was one of the most important fortresses still in the hands of Jocelyn II, and one of the most strongly fortified, and laid siege to it, preventing food and supplies from reaching it until it was about to surrender. At that point, news reached Zangi of the killing of his deputy in Mosul, so he was compelled to lift the siege and hasten back to his capital in order to deal with the situation there. The Crusaders in the fort were afraid that he would return to attack them again, so they sent word to Husam ad-Din Timurtash al-Artuki, telling him that they wanted to surrender this position of theirs to him before it fell into the hands of their bitter enemy. Thus the Crusaders of Edessa lost all their fortresses east of the Euphrates, as a direct result of their main base falling into the hands of Zangi. Jocelyn had nothing left of his vast principality, except a few scattered fortresses west of the Euphrates, such as Turbisel, Marash, Duluk, Samosata, Aintab, and Azaz, which Nuruddin Mahmud was able to capture later on. Thus, the first Crusader principality was wiped out. Ways in which Imad ad-Din Zangi fought the Crusaders. Imad ad-Din Zangi did not limit his fighting with the Crusaders solely to regular warfare, because that would have required him to stay in Syria all that time, and his strength would all have been exhausted in fighting these enemies, with the result that he would not have been able to focus on sorting out his numerous problems in Iraq. He understood the importance of benefiting from raids, that is, attacks followed by a sudden withdrawal, especially during his periods of absence from Syria. That is because this type of fighting yielded good results. 1. It made the Crusaders anxious and did not give them room to reorganize their troops and draw up a plan of attack on Muslim locations in the area, thus enabling the Muslims to defend and retain their positions. 2. It weakened the enemy's military and economic strength because of the killing, capture of prisoners, plundering and destruction that these attacks wrought. 3. It interrupted communications between the Crusader positions in northern Syria and did not give them the opportunity to come together and direct a united blow against the Muslims. In this type of fighting, Zangi relied on his Turkmen troops. He had paved the way for that by strengthening his ties with their leaders and giving them high military positions. Zangi appointed brilliant Turkmen commanders, such as Aytekin, Lujat al-Turki, al-Jurak, and others, and courageous fighters to launch what is known nowadays as a resistance struggle and guerrilla warfare. He made Aleppo a center for them, because of its geographical importance in relation to both Crusader and Muslim fortresses, as it lay between the Crusader states of Antioch and Edessa and controlled the transportation routes between them. It was also regarded as the best military base for launching rapid attacks against Crusader locations and movements, as well as against the caravans bringing them supplies and reinforcements. These groups of Turkmens launched many raids against the enemy's armies, camps, caravans, and rendezvous. There was not one year during the years of conflict and guerrilla warfare in which these Turkmen did not in this manner inflict various losses on their enemies. In Rajab 524 Hijri, for example, Zangi prepared a force to attack Azaz. In the following year, fighting broke out between Suwar and Jocelyn north of Aleppo, which resulted in victory for the Crusaders and the killing of many Muslims. This prompted Suwar to attack Rabd al-Atarib and capture some of its property and crops soon afterwards. 1 year later, in 526 Hijri, he ambushed the Crusaders of Turbasal and killed many of them. Suwar and his Turkmen troops continued to launch raids against the Crusades every time they got the opportunity to do so. Safar 527 Hijri saw many fights between the two sides, one of which took place near Qinasarine when King Baldwin of Jerusalem attempted to attack the outskirts of Aleppo. He was confronted by Suwar and some of his troops, and the battle led to defeat for the Muslims and their withdrawal to Aleppo, but their brave leader soon led them out again and they attacked a group of Crusaders, killing many and taking many others captive. Those who escaped fled back to their own land, and Suwar returned to Aleppo, carrying the heads of the slain and bringing captives, and that was a great day. Only a few days passed before the Crusaders of Edessa tried again to attack areas outside Aleppo, but Suwar went out to meet them, accompanied by Hassan al-Balbeki, the Emir of Manbij, and took them by surprise. He managed to decimate them and take the rest captive. Then he returned to Aleppo without any of his own soldiers being injured. In Jamadius Sani of the same year, Suwar, at the head of a detachment of horsemen, raided Turbasal and was confronted by the Crusaders of that county. But he managed to defeat them and harvested the heads of 1,000 men, which he carried back with him to Aleppo. In Rabiul Awwal of the following year, the commander of the Crusader fortress of Al-Qadmus came to Qinasarine, leading a force of knights from Antioch, where they were met by the troops of Aleppo led by Suwar. The fighting resulted in a victory for the Crusaders, and Zangi's commander was forced to make a deal with them. But he soon took one of their brigades by surprise in a rapid attack and managed to kill most of its soldiers. Then he went back to Aleppo, and the people were cheered by that after having been distressed. It was not long before the Knights of Edessa attacked the northern outskirts of Aleppo on their way to one of the Crusader camps. Suwar and his ally, the Emir of Manbij, counterattacked and killed many of them, whilst most of the rest were taken captive. Soon after that, in the same year, Suwar launched a big raid against the Crusader positions in the region of Al-Jazar and Zaradna. He defeated his enemies at Harim, then returned to Aleppo carrying booty and plunder. The range of raids and sudden attacks gradually started to increase, and in Rajab 530 Hijri, a great attempt was made by Suwar, who led 3,000 Turkmen horsemen and launched a surprise attack on Latakia and its environs, which the Crusaders were not expecting. Thus he managed to capture 7,000 prisoners and seize a large amount of booty, and he swept aside dozens of Crusader villages and farmsteads, from which the Muslims filled their hands with booty and took many prisoners. The Muslims of the region were delighted with this great victory achieved by Suwar, which was a disaster for the Crusaders of the north, who had never suffered anything like it. In fact, the internal strife witnessed by Antioch between 529 and 530 Hijri, due to the contest for power, contributed to a large extent to the inability of this county to defend itself against Muslim attacks. This prompted the Muslim commander to take the opportunity to achieve a great victory against the Crusaders of the north. At the end of the following year, Suwar launched a sudden attack against a large Byzantine expedition that was heading eastwards, and managed to kill and capture a number of its troops before heading back to his base in Aleppo. No more than a few months had passed following this attack before the Crusaders and Byzantines sent a joint expedition to occupy the citadel of Al-Tarib near Aleppo. After these forces had achieved their goal, a garrison was appointed to guard the Muslim prisoners who had been brought together there. Suwar soon came out, leading his forces, and attacked the Crusader Byzantine garrison, and he managed to free most of the Muslim prisoners and bring them back to Aleppo, where there was great rejoicing at this victory that had been achieved by its emir. In 533 Hijri, Suwar attacked a number of Crusader sites and captured some booty, but the Crusader knights managed to catch up with him and inflict a defeat on his forces that led to the capture of more than 1,000 horsemen, and he withdrew to Aleppo with those of his troops who had escaped. The clashes between the two sides continued for the next few years, and then slowed down somewhat during the period of 534 to 535 Hijri, after Zangi failed to capture Damascus, and the Damascenes and Crusaders formed an alliance against him. However, these clashes soon flared up again in 536 Hijri and the following years. In the first month of 536 Hijri, the Crusaders launched a swift attack against some Muslim sites west of Aleppo, and when they dispersed, Suwar sent a force of Turkmens, led by his son ad-Deen, who raided Crusader sites and reached as far as the walls of Antioch, then returned carrying a large amount of plunder and booty. A short while later, Lujat al-Turki raided some Crusader territories in the north, killing, capturing prisoners, and seizing booty. It was said that the number of slain was 700. In Ramadan of the same year, Suwar attacked a Crusader camp at Jisr al-Hadid, also known as the Iron Bridge, northeast of Antioch, after crossing the Orontes River with his troops towards the enemy's gathering. He managed to kill most of the troops in the camp and took the rest captive. The following year, the regent of Antioch went out and raided the valley of Baza near Aleppo, and was confronted by Suwar, who forced him to withdraw. Jocelyn managed to take this opportunity to attack the Muslim camps on the bank of the Euphrates and managed to capture 900 men. The two sides then decided to form a truce in which the regent of Antioch played no part. Hence the fighting continued between this county and the forces of Aleppo. When in Jamadul Awal, 538 Hijri, a large group of merchants went out from Antioch, guarded by a number of knights and carrying a lot of wealth and goods on their way to one of the neighboring Crusader areas. The Muslims launched a sudden attack and took them by surprise, and they managed to eliminate all the troops who had come out to protect them. They took as booty all the valuable goods that this party had been carrying. At the end of Dhul-Qa'dah in the same year, a group of 11 horsemen attacked a group of Crusader knights who had come out from Basuta and destroyed them, and they captured the ruler of Basuta, whom Suwar detained in Aleppo. Hence we see some of the methods that Zangi used in order to achieve his twin aims of forming an Islamic front and striking the Crusaders. By examining the relationship that Imad ad-Deen Zangi had with the Islamic forces, such as the emirates of different cities and local emirates in Mesopotamia and Syria, and the Kurdish and Turkmen tribes, we can clearly see the extent of his political acumen and his brilliance in military planning in his relationships in war and peace with those forces located in the region. From an official standpoint, he received a letter from the Seljuk Sultan Mahmud ibn Muhammad ibn Malik Shah in 522 Hijri, confirming his legitimate authority in Mosul, Mesopotamia, and Syria, and this position was confirmed again in the next few years. Nonetheless, this was not sufficient to prove his actual authority during that period, when many emirs were able to impose their authority on countless numbers of cities and regions, were largely independent of the Seljuk state, and benefited from a number of personal, political, geographical, economic, and human factors. So it was essential for Zangi to subjugate the various powers concentrated in that region, and to choose an offensive strategy from the outset. There were dangers surrounding such a strategy, the first of which was the possibility that a defensive alliance might be formed among the local emirs, which could later on be turned into an offensive alliance, as happened in the case of the Artukids. Secondly, there was nothing to fall back on in the event of being defeated by or retreating before the local emirs who surrounded him on all sides. He paid no heed to these dangers, however, and started attacking the local emirs from the outset, prompted by his own ambition and courage, and his confidence that he had sincere support from a populace that loved him for his stance towards the Crusaders, even before he was appointed as governor of Mosul. He was also helped by the Sultan's letter of authority referred to above, which gave him authority to rule Mosul, Mesopotamia, and Syria, for this implied that Zangi would have free rein to engage in fighting with local political entities and sweep them aside, using any means he saw fit to achieve this goal. More important than all this was Imad ad-Deen Zangi's political acumen, military brilliance, and farsightedness. He knew from the outset that if he adopted a friendly and peaceful approach towards the local emirs, their fortresses, cities, and emirates would continue to pose a threat to his emirate because of their proximity to it and their strategic locations, as they were located on highlands that sloped towards Mosul, and on their other side were mountain chains, interconnected rivers, and strong fortresses. Moreover, the isolationist policy followed by those emirs towards the Crusader threat that was advancing eastwards, and the resulting scattering of Muslim economic, military, and human resources had rendered these emirates incapable of withstanding the encroaching Crusader threat. This was at a time when Zangi had to strive to remove the obstacles that stood in the way of uniting the divided and scattered emirates into one united Islamic front. Imad ad-Deen's political and military role in the Islamic history. It may be said that Imad ad-Deen Zangi was able to fulfill a large part of his plan and carve out for himself a special position in Islamic history as a brilliant politician, capable military leader, and wise Muslim who understood the danger posed to the Islamic world by the Crusaders. He managed to direct historical circumstances in the Muslims' favor by bringing together the Muslim forces after eliminating the factors that led to division and dissent, uniting the various cities and emirates within the framework of a single state, and making the most of what that state had to offer in terms of resources that could stop the Crusader advance. Once he had accomplished this, he could organize attacks against the Crusader bases. These were the factors that prompted Zangi to form a policy of attack and occasionally interrupted the peaceful relations and truces that were dictated by circumstances. At the same time, Zangi strove to secure the borders of his emirate towards the east and northeast, where Kurds and Turkmen in these regions formed an element of grave danger to his emirate, especially when his relations with the Western Emirates were in crisis or when he ventured far from his base in Mosul. The importance of the role played by Zangi in Muslim history is clear to us, because he is regarded as the first commander who brought the Muslim forces together in accordance with a specific plan to confront the increasing Crusader danger, a danger which had not been stopped by the previous attempts that had been made before Zangi, especially those who had been carried out by Maudud ibn al-Tuntagin from 502 to 507 Hijri, and by the Artukids al-Ghazi and Balak from 512 to 518 Hijri. It is most likely that if Zangi had been able to capture Damascus and his attempt to unite Syria had succeeded, and if he had not been killed at the peak of his series of victories against the Crusaders, he would have been able to complete the remaining stages of his plan. The modern researcher would then have had a clear, complete picture of the role that Zangi played in Islamic history, which is a decisive role the significance of which becomes clear if we realize that the efforts of Nur ad-Din Mahmud and Salahaddin after him were no more than the completion of the work begun by Imad ad-Din Zangi. End of part 8 of chapter 3.